What are the fastest ways that people damage their brain without even realizing it?
I think the most important way that we damage our brains is much more philosophical than biological or physiological. But the way we think about things actually directly changes our physiology. So like that's the link there. But the most probably the most damaging thing is a narrative that we tell ourselves that as we get older, our function, especially our brain function, our cognitive function, is just going to decline, right? And there's nothing we can do about it. And this is what we've been told for decades, probably more than a century at this point. Right at the beginning of the early 20th century, there was like a famous physician who popularized the idea that like once you get to 60 years old, you're basically useless, right? Your brain and your body are falling apart, and like you just need to be turfed out the back, left to wander alone in the wilderness so you can die because you're useless. But and we've kind of started to believe that ourselves, right? Everybody just kind of thinks, I'm going to get old, things are going to start to fall apart, my brain's not going to function as well. And when we do that, when we think that, and when we believe that, unsurprisingly, that becomes true because we stop investing in the things that are actually going to be beneficial to our brains. This is something that the amazing psychologist Ellen Langer calls stereotype embodiment theory, right? We think we're going to get old and decrepit, so we become old and decrepit because we just stop doing the things that support our brains. We stop looking after ourselves, we stop going out, we stop doing new things, we stop moving as much. And then because we believe there's no point, it's not going to make any difference, that's then what stimulates the decline. So I think that's the most important thing that we need to change because we know that that doesn't have to be the case.
And so when does cognitive decline like actually begin? Like when does it become like risky to stop doing these things and investing in our brain?
So if you there's basically two answers to this. One is when does cognitive decline start on average across the entire population? And then the other is when does it start in an individual? And we often think that they are both the same when actually they're not. So at the population level, cognitive decline tends to start sometime in your 20s, right? So you and I are both already well past that point. Um, and then from there, it's sort of like on average, cognitive decline kind of continues sort of linearly, just like slowly decrease. Cognitive function slowly decreases over time, and then sometimes sort of somewhere between your 60s and 80s, it sort of like drops off a bit more. It's obviously a little bit more complicated than that because there are multiple things that go into cognitive function. But those cognitive functions that do tend to decline on average are like processing speed, executive functions, which is like decision making, certain parts of work you're working, or short-term memory. But other parts of cognitive function actually stay very stable. So even into your 70s and 80s, you increase or at least maintain something called crystallized intelligence, which is a fancy word of saying wisdom, right? Our ability to kind of, maybe our brains aren't quite as fast or as sharp, but they kind of are better at integrating multiple parts of information and kind of building a bigger picture. So there are some parts of cognitive function that generally don't decline as much. So that's kind of on average. On the individual level, it can be very different. So at that level, cognitive function tends to peak around about the time that you finish formal education. So the more levels of education you go through, and like the higher your educational attainment, like high school, college, 2-year, 4-year, grad school, the further you go along that, the longer you spend in formal education, sort of the higher and later the peak of your cognitive function on average. And then from there, the cognitive function starts to decline whenever you leave school. So for some people that could be in their early 20s. For me, that was like in my 30s. I was a student for like most of my lifetime. And then sort of on average it starts to decline. However, there's this group of people that are now called super agers, whose cognitive function basically stays really stable. Like from like 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it stays about the same. And we used to think that this was quite rare. And people do, I think the population thinks this is quite rare. But actually, there's studies going back, like they started in the 50s and they were published in the 80s, that basically said that probably at least half of people can maintain their cognitive function well into their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. So again, like when I'm telling you that it's our belief that we lose cognitive function that's the big problem, that actually seems to be the case, because that could be the norm if we believed it. So then it's a case of like, well, when does cognitive function start to decline for an individual? And that's probably when they stop engaging in the things that we know support cognitive function, right? So we know that education is important. So the way that then translates longer term is like, how complex is your job? How much do you have to do problem solving? How much like social interaction are you getting? How novel is it? Like, how are you, are you learning new skills? Or are you just doing the same thing again and again and again? And then it's also, well, are you maintaining your physical activity level? Are you maintaining your cardiovascular health, which tends to decline as we get older? It doesn't have to, but we get busy and we get tired, and we don't go to the doctor, and we sort of like gain a bit of weight, and we stop working out. And so that's when that period of decline seems to happen. So there are multiple things we can do here. One is, if we continue to focus on all those things that we know build cognitive function in the first place, we can actually push out that period of decline a bunch, right? So we can maintain a certain level, and then when it does start to decline, because we can't prevent aging entirely, that decline could be significantly reduced. And so, in reality, if you're thinking about yourself, when does my cognitive decline start? Sort of technically, maybe the function, but also especially the risk of decline starts the minute you stop attending to all these things that we know are really important, which we do a lot of when we're kids. We move a lot, we learn a lot. Hopefully we eat a good diet. But as soon as we start to stop attending, or we sleep a lot when we're kids and we're learning, right? Sleep is really important. As soon as we stop attending to those things, that's when the risk starts to increase.
So I think one of the other things people can do too is stop the bleeding. And I know there's things that accelerate aging in our brain. And I guess I'm curious for you, if someone in their 30s wanted to ruin their brain in 10 years or less, what would their lifestyle look like?
Yeah, it probably looks a lot like the typical Western lifestyle. You're you're sedentary, you're inside all day, and because you're sedentary and inside all day and you're exposed to bright light at night, you don't sleep very well, or because you're busy watching Netflix or whatever. So you're inside, not moving, not sleeping, and then you're eating a standard Western diet, which is very nutrient poor, very calorie dense, very easy to overeat. So that's going to lead you to have metabolic syndrome, prediabetes, cardiovascular disease, and those are all the big ticket items, right? You tick all of those boxes. Cognitive decline is certainly high up on the list of things that you're going to experience, and we actually see this. So typically, we used to think that dementia was a thing that happened when you were older. So like they call it older, age-related dementia or senile dementia. Senile basically meaning that you're older than 65 when it happens. But now we're seeing more and more what they call young onset dementia, which is people younger, in their 50s and 60s potentially experiencing dementia, and all those lifestyle factors that I mentioned are significant risk factors for that. So that kind of encapsulates how the Western lifestyle really can be geared up to accelerate cognitive decline.
Yeah, and I bring this up, because I do think that a lot can be done by just stopping certain things, right? And, making these small shifts. And it's not about like overhauling your complete, lifestyle. And obviously I'm sure people that need to do that. But generally speaking, it's just like there's a few major habits that people are doing that are like leading to more cognitive decline. And I think that the the sign for most people, I think it comes down to like memory. Like I can't remember things. I can't remember what I did like on Monday. I can't remember what I did like last week, or can't remember what I ate for breakfast. Is that still the gold standard sign that your brain is aging faster, or is there something else we should pay attention to?
So, a couple of things that I didn't mention is that if you're going to like really compound that, you'd probably be smoking a lot, like, or vaping, and then maybe you chase it with several beers every evening. That's probably gonna be helpful. That's gonna be helpful too. Um, but to So and this is so like first I want to go back to the thing that you said, which is like small changes can have a big effect, and I think this is really like the most important thing that I like to tell people about, because I mean I already listed like 5 or 6 things, right? And some of those are like are big things, like diet is a massive ball of worms, as is physical activity, right? So you could end up with a list of like 20, 30, 40, 50 things, and you're like, oh my God, do I have to like do all of these things in order to prevent dementia or decrease the risk of dementia? And the answer is no, because all the evidence suggests that, right, you move one part, right, you pull one lever, and it's a whole interconnected network. So if you start to do physical activity, then you sleep better, right? And so like multiple things happen at the same time. If you sleep better, then you're more sociable and you're more likely to choose a meal that's going to be nourishing rather than not, and you're more likely to go and do physical activity. So all of these things kind of compound really quickly if you like find one way in. You're like, this is the thing that I can move the needle on, and then the whole kind of network of risk shifts, right? Because you improve your sleep, then you also improve your blood pressure and you improve your blood sugar and all these other things that are risk factors. Just physical activity does the same thing. So just focusing on one thing can make a big difference. The memory thing is interesting because when we think about dementia, most of us think about memory, right? You just forget stuff. And that's important because memory issues are a big part of dementia. But actually, some of the more common and more impactful changes are related to maybe other stuff like executive function. Being able to do complex tasks, engage in the world, make decisions, financial planning, that kind of stuff. Like that's where some of the big impacts are seen, particularly early on. Um, with dementia or people who experience marked cognitive impairment, which sort of happens before dementia. But the reason why focusing on memory, it's important to do because that sort of that scenario you mentioned, like I can't remember what happened yesterday, or I can't remember where I put my keys, I can't remember what I ate for lunch. Well, you should probably be able to remember what you ate for lunch if it's the same day. But like, you know what I mean? Like, can't remember where I put my keys is like a perfect example. People are like, am I losing my mind because I can't remember where my keys are? And most of the time, that's not the case. So that's not really a sign that that you're experiencing cognitive decline for a few reasons. One is that when we're we've experienced several decades of life on this earth. You have put your keys down thousands of times, and your brain doesn't really consider that to be particularly useful information. It's just like, I know those keys are going to be there. Like, I'll come back and find them later. So, and also when we put our keys down, we're usually distracted by something else, right? We're bringing in the groceries, or there's like kids or dogs or whatever. And so the things that are required for us to make a memory, which is like focus, so we need to like focus on the fact that it's happening. It needs to be important. It needs to be distinctive, right? This edition of me putting my keys down is different from these other edition of me putting my keys down. Right? Those things usually aren't in place. When we sort of like these day-to-day things, we just don't remember because they're just actually not that important to remember. And there's only so much that our brains can remember. So usually when you can't remember where your keys are, whatever, it's either because you weren't paying attention, or because you've done it so many times that just in the grand scheme of things, your brain has decided that there are other things that are more important to remember. Or you're probably like stressed and a bit sleep deprived. And those are actually much more common causes of just like those slight lapses of like, I know where it is, I know your name, but I can't quite remember it. That's much more likely to be because you're sort of like stressed or distracted or a bit sleep deprived rather than you're going to experience dementia. Now, if you don't sleep for long periods of time, that obviously increases your risk of later dementia. But those sort of day-to-day memory issues don't necessarily have to be like a big warning sign. However, on the kind of pathway of dementia, like from like a normal, healthy, functioning brain through to like full diagnosis of dementia, there are now multiple stages. And the first stage is something called subjective cognitive decline. And that's now like formally part of these diagnostic pathways. And that basically means that you know something is not quite right, but you couldn't pick it up on a cognitive function test because like your average, because like if you did your test, you're like still within the average and is like it still kind of looks normal. Like you wouldn't fail the test. But you know something's not quite right. And so that's the point where, all this kind of stuff that we've started to talk about, that's, that point is reversible as far as we know, certainly. So you can definitely, if you intervene then, right, you're starting to notice some stuff, but you also know that you're not sleeping that well and, you haven't gone to the gym for a year and yeah, your diet probably isn't as good as it could be. And, maybe it's a few beers every night, right? That's the point where we have a lot of time and space to intervene. So subjective cognitive decline can be memory related, but it might also be related to like just feeling a little fuzzy, a little foggy, not necessarily, not feeling like you can kind of make decisions in the same way, or like, some specific skills have started to deteriorate. So it's sort of loosely defined, but that kind of period where you feel like something's not quite right, that doesn't mean you will get dementia, but those who experience subjective cognitive decline do have an increased risk of dementia. But that risk does seem to be reversible if you then start to attend some of the risk factors that you might have.
So you mentioned stress, which I think is something that we all struggle with. And I know that chronic stress is a major risk factor and that can really, wreak havoc on the brain. Talk about the impact of stress and why people should really be concerned with that as it relates to cognitive decline.
Yeah, so there's this double-edged sword of talking about stress, right? Because people, when you talk about stress, people start to stress about the fact that they're stressed. Um, and there's actually at least one study that shows that if people have been stressed recently and they believe that stress is bad for their health, then that stress impacts their health. But if for some reason they don't think that stress impacts their health, then actually that stress doesn't impact their health. It's sort of interesting. It's like it requires this cognitive component of worrying about the stress itself. Um, so we do know that chronic stress increases the risk of depression, increases the risk of dementia. It's measured in a whole bunch of different ways. But studies might call it vital exhaustion, they might call it burnout, they might call it high allostatic load. Um, it tends to have, right, there's the mental component, so burnout being like the perfect example of that. But then you can also measure it. People who have high allostatic load or high chronic stress tend to have higher blood pressure, they have higher blood sugar, they have other pictures of sort of metabolic syndrome. They're more likely to drink, they're more likely to smoke, they're more likely to have certain nutrient deficiencies like vitamin D, and some of that's like cause and consequence. And they have higher levels of inflammation that you can measure in a blood test, like CRP. And a lot of that seems to be just like the effect of having the exposure to this chronic stressor. Some of that, at least, happens through what stress is doing. So, stress, and persistently elevated cortisol, persistent activation of the sympathetic nervous system. This can prevent the brain from fully recovering and adapting, or say like fully experiencing sleep and recovery, because which it needs, right? We're constantly putting new information into the brain, giving the exposing it to a whole bunch of things. It needs to rest, recover, adapt, just like your body does from exercise. And stress can create this like sort of almost like overtraining for the brain kind of picture. And so that's like during the day itself, but equally like one way to determine is this stress chronic stress is if it's negatively impacting your sleep. And either because you can't sleep, you go to bed late, wake up early, any of those, then that kind of qualifies as a chronic stressor, and we know how critical sleep is for the brain. So stress is certainly really important. Is a risk factor for long-term cognitive decline. But we also know that stress is part of the process of, creating adaptation in the brain, right? So like exercise is stressful, right? You can kind of measure, like your cortisol goes up, your heart rate goes up, your adrenaline goes up. But as long as you have a period of time to relax and adapt afterwards, right, then you get benefit from that. So it's not that stress is inherently bad. It's stress that doesn't switch off or that we never get a chance to recover from. So there are a few different ways to tackle that. One is, do we try and avoid the things that are these chronic stresses as much as we can, right? Not always possible if it's family stress or financial stress or something like that. But if there are things in your life that are stressful that cannot be there, right? Eliminating those can certainly be helpful. And then another part is going to be how, giving yourself tools to better manage stress in the moment so it has less of like a total effect. And that's where things like breath work can have a big effect. So you can rapidly calm down the nervous system by just like slow paced breathing with very long exhales. That's very popular right now. But even things like just like closing your eyes for a moment, or like prioritizing what you need to get done in the moment. Those things can decrease the stress response. And then we can also sort of increase our buffer against stress, and that like physical activity is really good at that. There's something called the cross stressor adaptation hypothesis, which basically says that if you have these bouts of stress due to exercise, you then get better at dealing with other stresses. And then some, other tools like mindfulness and meditation that all kind of have a very similar effect. Like there's no good evidence that like you have to do one or the other, but just like you can sort of build in these bigger buffers. So like all those different tools are possible to help us deal with or reduce the effect of stress, so that it's not then having this sort of like knock-on long-term effect.
Let's talk about metabolic dysfunction, like blood sugar and insulin resistance, because I've heard Alzheimer's and dementia called like type 3 diabetes before. I'd love to get your thoughts on the relationship between nutrition and our brains. I mean, is it overhyped, or does it actually have that big of an impact as far as to cognitive decline?
Um, yeah, great question. So, and also an important question because over the last few decades, we've definitely seen an overall deterioration of the metabolic health of the population. Right, metabolic syndrome is much more common. Prediabetes, type 2 diabetes is more common. Um, and when you look at trajectories of cognitive function in people over time, um, the two most important, or like two of the most like important physical risk factors related to metabolic health that you mentioned are high blood pressure and high blood sugar. Um, more so than anything else. And so if you there's a big study done in the UK, the English longitudinal study of aging, and they took people's cognitive function multiple times over multiple years, and they classified them based on like, is your blood sugar normal? So it would be a fasting blood sugar less than 100, or an HbA1c of less than 5.6%. And then they had people who had prediabetes, so that's over 100 or over 5.6. And then they had those who had like type 2 diabetes. And essentially, when you went from those with normal blood sugar regulation to prediabetes to type 2 diabetes, the faster their cognitive function declined over time. So we know that if you have poor blood sugar regulation, on average, your cognitive function is going to decline faster. Some of this seems to be related to glucose metabolism changes in the brain. So like you said, some people have called Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes because when you look at brain scans of people with diabetes, one of like the signature things that you see is a decrease in glucose uptake into certain areas of the brain. And the idea is that if you have very persistently high blood sugar, the brain kind of like turns down the signal on that glucose. It takes up less of it, because it doesn't want to expose the brain to all that blood sugar, because that can have negative effects. So there's potentially some like central glucose metabolism issues. However, yeah, so part of it is certainly driven by metabolic health, in the rest of your body. But part of it is probably also related to how you use your brain. So there are studies that show that in even people with some early Alzheimer's disease, if you stimulate their brain with cognitive tasks, they can actually increase the amount of glucose that they take up. So some people have argued that it's not that the glucose isn't getting in, it's that the brain isn't asking for that glucose in the first place, right? It's the difference between, how much blood sugar is going into your muscles if you're not moving them versus how much will you draw in if you then start to, do some push-ups or something. So some of it is definitely related to poor metabolic health, but then the other part is, are we, using our brains enough? Are we like stimulating them to take up that glucose? So I don't think so. I think we're at the point where most people probably wouldn't say that type 3 diabetes is an adequate description of what happens in Alzheimer's disease, but certainly insulin resistance and poor blood sugar control is a risk factor. And one of the things that you see because of that is a decrease in glucose uptake into the brain.
That's wild. I mean, thanks for breaking that down, because I think that, oftentimes, things do get, over sensationalized, right, with content and stuff. But it's also important to be like, hey, like there is like serious risk here that you have to like clean up your lifestyle if you want to improve the health of your brain. You mentioned cigarettes, and I've dove a lot into like vaping recently. Had a couple experts on to talk about the dangers of vaping. Um, do you have a take on that? Is it nicotine specifically? Is it like the carcinogens from cigarettes? Like what is it that is contributing to cognitive decline?
Yeah, that's a great question and an important one. I think actually, if you look at the research on nicotine, if you give people who don't normally get nicotine exposure, right, non-smokers, and they don't vape or anything else, and you give them a dose of nicotine, like 1 to 0.5 or 1 to 4 milligrams of nicotine through a gum or something like that, you will actually boost certain cognitive functions because nicotine binds to acetylcholine receptors in the brain, which are really important for like information encoding and focus. So actually, there's lots of studies that show that nicotine can actually improve cognitive function. So that doesn't mean that I recommend nicotine, right? It's still addictive. You can become tolerant to it, so you have to take more and more to get the same effect. But like isolating the effect of nicotine on cognitive function, like very acutely, not necessarily a bad thing. So then it's definitely down to the other things that are in cigarettes, like all all the particles that get vaporized, the tar. There are heavy metals that you get exposed to. All those other things are probably what's having the negative effect, and you see sort of similar effects with like air pollution, right? High exposure to air pollution from roads or whatever increases the risk of cognitive decline. So I think those can thought to be quite similar in terms of their effect. Then thinking about vaping, this is where we're not really sure. So is and I think the last time we spoke, we talked a little bit about this. Like, are some of these more modern devices increasing the amount of, say, nicotine or cannabinoids that we're consuming? And that certainly does start to seem to be the case, right? It's so accessible, it's so easy. You can consume massive doses quite quickly. It has this halo effect of it's healthier, right? I'm not smoking, right? I'm vaping, and the kind of the research, we're really just right at the beginning of it because vapes haven't existed on that scale for long enough to see whether they increase the risk of dementia, right? We might have to wait 20, 30, 40 years before we really start to see that. However, we know that some of the excipients and flavorings and other things that are in these vapes can negatively affect the lungs. They can increase inflammation. They can cause issues in their own right. And there are some small studies that suggest that teenagers who vape may have decreased elements of cognitive function, but it's certainly nothing that's like definitive. But I think all the evidence definitely suggests that it's probably not something that you would want to avoid as much as possible if you're thinking about your long-term brain health.
When it comes to things that can ruin our brain health, I know technology is something that gets like thrown in the mix a lot too, as like screen time, blue light, all the things. What's the science say about that? Like, how long would I have to stare at my phone each day or scroll on social media for it to really impact my cognitive function?
This episode is brought to you by Suji. I've been a longtime fan of blood flow restriction training for a while, and I recently had Suji's founder, Alex, on the podcast to unpack the amazing benefits of it and how you can implement it into your existing training routine. One of the ways I've been implementing it lately is with my personal training clients. Everyone's got that one client whose knees start complaining before they even warm up. So we started using Suji. It's a wearable compression device that wakes up the muscles without loading the joints. Basically, it's how we keep training hard on days when the knees aren't feeling it. We've seen faster activation, less pain, and way more confidence in movement. Simple setup, big difference. Give Suji a try at trysuji.com and use my code DougBopst for 10% off. Again, trysuji.com, use code DougBopst for 10% off. Now back to the show.
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're right. Like, I think every generation has had this like, this is going to be the thing that like ruins our cognitive function, right? So like it was TV, and then it's cell phones, and now it's social media and AI. And I do think it's worth thinking about. But there's this idea of something called digital dementia, you might have heard of, which is basically this idea that by using all these technologies, we're going to decrease our cognitive function long term. There are two main reasons for that. One is you're offloading complex cognitive tasks that are important for brain function, right? We need to use our brains for them to still work, long term. If we're offloading those things to technology, then our brains aren't getting the kind of work out. It's the same as like you stop going to the gym, your muscle mass and strength declines. If you stop using your brain, it will also, its function will decline. So that's part of it that we need to consider. And then the other part is, if you're spending all your time inside staring at a screen, you're not spending time socializing with other people in real life. You're not exercising. You're probably not sleeping as much. You're probably not, attending to and like helping, preparing a high quality meal at home. So maybe your diet quality decreases. So the amount of time you spend staring at your phone to negatively impact your cognitive function is probably the amount of time that means that you then have less time to do those other things that I just mentioned. But if you're still doing all those other things that I mentioned, then sometimes staring at your phone, probably not such a big deal. And then similarly, if the way you use technology is not decreasing your engagement in skills that you want your brain to be good at. And that could be like using ChatGPT to design experiments in the lab, which is like my job. That's a skill that I need to have. Or write a book, or any of those things. If you're offloading those tasks to technology, then that's probably a negative thing because you're not using your brain the way you want to use it. If you are using technology to sort of help you do those things so that you can do them better, and it still requires you to problem solve and learn new skills, then it's also probably not such a bad thing. So I always think about technology in those terms. Like, how much is it pulling me away from these things that I know are important for my brain versus can I use it to actually help support some of these things that I need to do? And if that's the case, and it's not stopping you from doing all these other healthy behaviors, then it can be a net positive. So there are studies in like with video games, for example, that gamers can, or starting a new video game can improve cognitive function in like young people as well as in older adults because it's a new stimulus. It's like it requires complex tasks and problem solving. It's like an immersive world, right? All of these things kind of new stimuli for the brain. That could be beneficial as long as it's not causing those other downstream effects. So I think some of like what we're kind of told is a bit alarmist. But as long as we're kind of balancing those things, it doesn't have to be a net negative.
So I should stop using ChatGPT to like help me with research and stuff?
Well, so this is a good question. So if you are actively engaged in the process and you're generating the questions and then you're using the outputs to actually meaningfully learn that stuff, not necessarily such a bad thing, except for the fact that ChatGPT is known to hallucinate. So it might not actually be telling you the truth. It might have made the facts up. So as long as you're, so I know people who do use ChatGPT in that way as like it's like another person to kind of bounce ideas off of and help you do research and help you build your ideas and thought process and that kind of stuff. And so as long as if you're doing that and it's still cognitively demanding and, you sort of check up and make sure that everything is telling you is true, doesn't have to be a negative thing. If it's, hey, I'm interviewing this guy, please write me 10 questions for my interview. And then you never think about those questions. You just read them off. And then you don't listen to the answer. You just like move on to the next question. Then that's probably an issue because you've actually not engaged your brain in any of that process. And I know that's not what you're doing. So there are definitely ways to balance this and just think about like, am I actually still involving my brain in this process? And if you are, then, might not be such a bad thing.
Speaking of involving your brain, I know exercise is paramount for brain health, as we've talked about. What's like the protocol or like the minimum effective dose? Like if somebody's in their 20s or 30s or even their 40s and like, hey, like, I want to maximize cognitive benefit and reduce my risk of cognitive decline or improve cognitive function. Like, what does that look like?
So I think you would, a sort of a comprehensive program will balance 3 different areas of exercise. So, and because different types of exercise actually support the functions of different areas of the brain. So the first is aerobic exercise. If you're completely sedentary, right, you're either older or you've just like never worked out, then going out and doing some walking, we know significantly improves cognitive function. Right? There are studies that show that. So if you've like never exercised before, a brisk walk for like half an hour to 45 minutes a few times a week, like that's enough. That's a good starting point. Of course, intensity and dose do matter. So as you get fitter, or if you're somebody who's already familiar, with exercises regularly, then it's important to make sure that you're getting some intensity too. So on the aerobic exercise side, we know that doing longer and harder sort of or like some sprint intervals also seems to provide additional benefit on top of just like moderate intensity kind of jogging or brisk walking. So that's been done with things like the Norwegian 4x4 protocol, but anything that sort of over maybe 10 to 20 minutes involves, you're pushing the pace for 30 seconds to a few minutes and then taking some periods of rest. And, the exact number doesn't really matter. What matters actually is that you're generating lactate. Because lactate seems to be the bridge from the exercise that you're doing to benefits to the brain, because lactate goes into the brain and generates something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is really important for maintaining the function of neurons in the brain. And you do make BDNF when you exercise, but that BDNF doesn't really get into the brain. What gets into the brain is the lactate you produce, and then that turns on the BDNF signal locally in the brain. So building up a regular, 2, 3, 4 times a week aerobic activity with, 1 or 2 of those being some kind of sprint interval or high intensity interval. And again, just needs to be 10 or 20 minutes. Doesn't have to be massive. Like that's probably what that part looks like. Then the next component is resistance training. So by comparison, so where aerobic exercise improves or supports things like the gray matter, like the hippocampus, which is really important for memory, and aerobic exercise particularly improves memory of all the different types of exercise and all the different brain functions. Aerobic exercise seems to support memory the most. Resistance training seems to support the white matter, which is like this big chunk in the middle of your brain that's really responsible for like lots of fast connections and decision making and some of the complex cognitive functions that humans have. Resistance training supports white matter primarily because it results in the production of things like IGF-1, and IGF-1 is really important for white matter. And we see from randomized controlled trials that if you do more resistance training, then you have improvements in things like executive function, so decision making, which are sort of important, which those parts of the brain are responsible for. So resistance training programs that have been shown to have this benefit are like twice a week, maybe 45 minutes to an hour, a very basic like bodybuilding style program. You do 6 to 8 machines, you do 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps, right? In a can be a linearly progressive manner, particularly if you haven't done a lot of weight training before. Like it's that kind of stuff. It's just the basics. A basic resistance training program is gonna get you that benefit. And of course, it doesn't have to be weights. It can be bands, it can be blood flow restriction, it can be like there are multiple different ways to do that, but some kind of resistance training a couple of times a week is going to be important. And then the last part is coordinative exercise. So this is where you're responding to the environment. You have more of a complex motor skill component. And when they've compared 2 different types of exercise that have the same physical strain, but one involves complex coordination and the other one doesn't. So like you're comparing jogging to badminton, for instance, then you seem to get right. The jogging is beneficial for your brain, but the badminton seems to have a slightly bigger benefit. So then there are multiple ways to do this. Either some of your aerobic training can be these kinds of, ball sports, team sports, anything that kind of requires you to respond and react to the environment, requires you to learn a new complex motor skill, or you can layer those things on top. I haven't mentioned dancing. Dancing seems to be like magic for the brain. It's like the exercise that benefits mood, depression, like cognitive function. So that's basically it. You can either add on additional things that include coordinative movement, or you make some of your aerobic exercise or interval training, have some of those more coordinative components. But ideally, you're doing something every day, and then a couple of those resistance training, and then you're sort of balancing those other 2 across the other days.
So you brought up dancing being good for the brain, and I think a few other things, that I've heard over the years is like doing crossword puzzles or like learning a new language or playing an instrument. Like, are these things that you think people should do over the course of their life, even if they're not like approaching, that age where they're, kind of in quote unquote getting older? Well, and if so, like what types of things do you recommend to stimulate the mind on a regular basis?
Yeah. So, yes, I think these things are incredibly important. In my view of how the brain works and how we support its function, I think the way we use it, the way we stimulate it is the most important. Much like if you want to get fitter and stronger, the most important thing is that you exercise, right? You have to train, right? That's what drives adaptation. That's what drives improvements in function. But then, a high quality diet, sleeping properly, all that kind of stuff helps to support that adaptation. But really, the training is the primary driver. And I think a lot of that is similar in the brain. So I would separate out a couple of those things that you mentioned. So like when you're talking about like crossword puzzles and Sudoku and these kinds of things, those things require focus, but they're not necessarily really that challenging. And so these are something that Gloria Mark, who's a really cool psychologist, calls rote activities. And these can be beneficial because actually it's an opportunity for you to, when you're doing a whole bunch of stuff and rushing around, it's actually almost like a bit meditative. It's a bit, it's almost like recovery. It's a type of recovery for the brain to do these things. So they can be really beneficial, playing games on your phone and that kind of stuff. They can actually be beneficial, but it's more as it's almost like a relaxation strategy. If we're thinking about truly driving adaptation in the brain, like a proper training session, then we need something that requires focus, but is also cognitively challenging. So then these other things that you mentioned, I think, probably have a bigger effect. So learning a new language, learning a musical instrument, learning how to code in a computer, learning like art skills, playing video games, like complex video games, learning how to play those have been shown to have a similar effect. So anything that actually that requires a few different components, but is a complex skill, it probably integrates multiple senses, right? So you're having to see something, respond to it, maybe in short periods of time. So you're kind of training like rapid processing. And it requires some element of like risk or failure, right? So what really drives neuroplasticity, which is essentially the process of improving fitness in the brain to some extent, What really drives neuroplasticity is making mistakes. So it's a difference between my expectation of what I can do and what I can actually do. So it's that process of like stumbling through new grammar or verbs or vocabulary when you're learning a new language, or it's you're playing a musical instrument but like you can't get the timing right, or you hit the wrong note, or it's you're playing badminton and you think you can make this shot but like you can't make it. um it's that kind of engaging in those complex things, and there's this difference between what you want to be able to do and what you can actually do that drives kind of the resources towards your brain trying to adapt and improve function, and then that overall has this effect on overall brain function. So there is a very nice recent study that looked across lots of different types of those like complex skills. So it was art, languages, music, video games again. And what they saw was that when people are exposed to those things, either experts who do more of this in their real life or people who did them in a randomized controlled trial, you see improvements in brain function in networks that are susceptible to deterioration with aging. So like by actively engaging in like these complex skill-based processes, you're almost having like an anti-aging effect in the brain, which you can measure in terms of like brain activity. So those are the kinds of things that I think are really important. And I think it's something that we should do always, right? Regardless of how old you are, it's having a new hobby, trying to learn a new skill, going out into the world and interacting with people. Like these are things that should be lifelong pursuits, because that's what's going to contribute to sort of maintaining that level of cognitive function, for sort of decades into the future.
You said video games can help. I've heard that that's like something that can kind of damage the brain. So is there specific types of video games that are good for the brain?
So there are a couple of examples where video games. So I know people often raise their eyebrows when I'm like, oh, video games can be like a beneficial cognitive stimulus. There are a couple of scenarios where that's not necessarily the case. One is if you're a kid who's spending 18 hours a day playing video games, and that means that like you're not doing anything else, right? I mentioned that earlier, right? You're not moving, you're not sleeping, you're not any of that. So if it's instead like half an hour or an hour a few times a week, right? Those are very different prospects. So as long as the amount of time isn't pulling away from those other beneficial things, then it can be beneficial. And then there's some evidence to suggest that certain types of more violent video games in people who are high risk, like young people who are high risk, so that's usually young people with a history or experience of trauma, that combination could be detrimental. It can kind of like trigger or exacerbate some of the effects of previous trauma. So certain video games in certain kids who are high risk, right, we could probably set that aside. But beyond that, the video games that seem to have the biggest effect are those that are 3D, more immersive, require more like reaction and responding to the environment, problem solving, that kind of stuff. You probably have to remember your way around. Like if you have a big open world, like I'm a big like Zelda fan, so like Legend of Zelda, kind of you have this massive world you have to kind of explore and understand, and then you have to solve problems and all this kind of stuff. You have to learn skills. Those kinds of games are the ones that seem to have the potential for benefit. Super Mario 3D World is the one that's been studied the most, but there are other studies that have shown benefits from Minecraft, and then even some sort of like action and shooter games can have a similar effect, because again, they're complex. You have to strategize, you have to solve problems, right? You're playing Call of Duty, right? You have to organize with other groups, like you're socializing with people on the other side of the world. Like there could even be benefit from that, as long as some of those other kind of risk factors aren't in place.
I think what intimidates people is they're like, well, my brain can't change, or it's going to take like years or months or whatever for it to be normal again. What have you seen as far as turnaround time? Hold on. What have you seen as far as turnaround time from someone who is like just full of bad habits and behaviors to someone who's trying to change their life? How long does it typically take for the brain to recover, like generally speaking?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, the real answer is it depends. But I think the biggest hurdle, or the two biggest hurdles, one is, right, I just don't think my brain is going to change, right? We already talked about that right at the beginning. Just like believing there's not going to be any point in doing it. So like once we can sort of unpick that and show that that's not the case, and one of the reasons, that's kind of a great starting point. And one of the reasons why that's important is because if you don't think it's going to be worth it, then you're not actually going to engage in these things. But if we can magically support somebody to make behavior change, which you can do with like coaching and some apps are kind of getting a bit better at doing that kind of stuff, assuming they do make the changes, you can see very rapid improvements in risk factors. You can see improvements in sleep within days, potentially. Maybe it's weeks. And so if sleep was somebody's problem and you solve that problem, right, you can see improvements very, very quickly. Blood sugar control, you can get under control depending on how bad it is. Again, within weeks to a couple of months. Maybe you need dietary changes, maybe you need physical activity, maybe you need medications, but those changes can happen very rapidly. You can shift risk markers of like nutrient status and that kind of stuff, again, within days to weeks. So you can see that people can feel better very quickly if they actually get on top of this stuff, even within a few weeks.
What about like when people have severe cognitive decline or things like early dementia? Do you think once it's reached that point, it's too late, or can things be done to start to reverse the process then?
So there's two different parts of it, and there's also two different schools of thought. The formal school of thought is once you've got significant cognitive decline, you've got dementia, like it's not reversible. It's very, very unlikely that you can go from like having dementia to not having dementia. There are cases out there where people have said, by addressing all these different risk factors, improving lifestyle, all that kind of stuff, that people have made that switch, but it's kind of like individual case reports in some papers. It's not something that I would say is like can be routinely expected. Because maybe there's like one major thing that you can fix, and it was soon enough that you can kind of reverse that. So there are some people who say you can reverse Alzheimer's. I would say we don't really have good evidence for that yet. I would love for that to be the case. So I'm not like a naysayer. I just like we need a lot more evidence there. So I think we can have hope there, but I would say that once you've experienced significant cognitive decline and dementia, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to reverse that. However, all the things that I've talked about today, music, dancing, dietary improvement, supporting sleep, all of those things have been shown to improve symptoms and maybe some degrees of function, even in people who have already experienced cognitive decline. So it's not the same as reversing it, but you can still improve somebody's quality of life and like decrease their symptom burden with some of these factors. So ideally, if you can start earlier in the process, you might be able to reverse any changes that have started, certainly in terms of cognitive decline. That's kind of what's thought right now. Or ideally you start even sooner and you never start to experience any decline at all. That's probably most likely. But the further you are along that path, probably the harder it is to move the needle back in the other direction. But you can certainly help to control some symptoms and quality of life, with those similar interventions.
Switching gears a little bit, let's just say somebody like right now is feeling kind of foggy, unmotivated, just lack of clarity with being able to think. I know we've covered a lot. Like on days where you're feeling like that, like what's your like go-to to be able to like pull yourself out of the mud, if you will?
Usually when that happens to me, it has a very defined cause. So one might be a massive cognitive burden, right? So I can have days or strings of days where I'm like in meetings from 7 a.m. to 5 or 6 p.m. or later, and then I have to work again like after I've had some dinner, and like I've just never had a chance to take a break, right? You're constantly multitasking, constantly in meetings. And then that definitely can contribute to some of those feelings. And then the best thing that you can do in that scenario, if possible, is to figure out a better way to structure your day so that you can give yourself some predefined periods to actually do either high quality work or take a few minute break, like head outside and walk for a bit or whatever, if you can do that. So I kind of try to structure my days so that my high quality focused work is in the morning. That's when I feel my best. Everybody has a time of day when they feel their best, so you can structure it that way. And then those times of day when there's a time of day when maybe they're not quite fully switched on yet. And actually, for some people, that can be associated with improved like creative thinking, even though you're not like fully focused. So maybe that's when you have meetings or brainstorming sessions or something else. So like structuring your day to kind of match the tasks you need to do to kind of your natural energy levels, which we all sort of have throughout the day, that can help. Plus building in some breaks, even just like a 5-minute break, like not thinking about anything. There have been studies that show that you can kind of reset feelings of fatigue during the workday if you like watch 5 minutes of comedy clips on YouTube or something. Like that's enough to just like your brain just needs to switch off just for a few minutes, and then you can kind of get back to it. So that's one thing. Another one is probably if I haven't slept properly, right? So like if I haven't slept properly, that's going to be a big contributor to if I'm just like not really feeling great that day. There are 2 or 3 things that you can kind of do. Well, there's actually lots of things you do to combat that, but things that I might do is make sure I can like get myself exposed to some bright light. So bright light increases arousal. That offsets, at least in the moment, some of those kind of feelings of fogginess. We know that improves, like reaction time and some other sort of basic cognitive functions. I might do a quick workout if I can, because that has the same effect. It increases arousal. It kind of offsets some of those kind of feelings of fogginess if you're sleep deprived. And it doesn't need to be much, right? Bang out 20 push-ups or something like that. That's it. 1 10-second sprint across the yard or something like that. That can be enough to kind of overcome it. I enjoy caffeine, and so caffeine has some very interesting effects, particularly when you're sleep deprived. It sort of upregulates some receptors in the brain that get downregulated, particularly when you're sleep deprived. So I think caffeine actually has some of its most important effects when we're sleep deprived. But you also need to counterbalance that if you're drinking coffee at 6 p.m. because you need to work and you're foggy, right? Yeah, then you're not going to be able to sleep properly because there's still coffee in the system. So try and if you're going to use caffeine, try and use it earlier in the day so you can then sleep properly the next night. But yeah, so just some of those kind of tricks to just like very quickly increase arousal, light, music, exercise, like those are the kinds of things I might use in the moment. And those are probably the 2 biggest reasons: stress or cognitive overload, and sleep issues that most of us are probably going to feel from day to day. So yeah, there's that combination of how can I make myself feel better right now, and then there's can I do that whilst also making sure that I'm going to be able to get a break if I need it, or get a little bit more sleep tonight so that I feel better the next day.
Well, Tommy, this has been awesome. Thanks so much for coming back on the podcast. I know you got a book that will be coming out that we're going to be having a whole other conversation about, but feel free to tease it out if you'd like.
I really appreciate and really enjoyed this conversation. I am looking forward to our next one as well, and I appreciate everybody for listening. But yeah, I have a book coming out in March 2026 called The Stimulated Mind. I've sort of already told you why I think that cognitive stimulus and how we use our brains is a primary driver of how our brains function. But it's essentially like a how-to manual for how do I improve how my brain feels today, and then how do I decrease my risk of cognitive decline long term. You can go to thestimulatedmind.com and pre-order it. And if anybody's interested in it, like pre-orders are really helpful for authors, because it helps tell the publishers that they think that the book's going to be well received. So thestimulatedmind.com, you can order it wherever you normally order a book. There'll be sort of updates on my Instagram channel at Dr. Tommy Wood. And then I also have a free Substack that includes a podcast and a few other things with my colleague, Josh Turkner, who's a neurologist. And so you can sign up for the free Substack at betterbrain.fitness, and there'll be a whole bunch of stuff there too.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming back on the pod, Tommy. Appreciate our friendship. Appreciate you. Looking forward to having you back on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is really great, and I'm looking forward to that too.